Okay, this is the second session, second day, Bootstrap seminar. And we're going to pick up and carry on. But I'd like to just stop and see if anyone has some comments or questions that they'd like to put right away that sort of tie in with what we've been talking about and what we're going to talk about. All right. Okay, Mark.
Doug, a lot of the stuff you've talked about so far, I see, if not right now, but in the very near future, maybe next couple of months, being implemented under like Windows and things like that. At least the front end part of it. Would you care to comment on that and how that links in with what you know about the other strategies that may not be available?
I don't think I'm really up to date on what a lot of them is doing. And I had a chance to talk with a person that was building things on X Windows the other day and learned learned enough about that to see that it had the kind of freedom to put what we're talking about between it and the applications. I'm not sure about the others. He thought that Microsoft Windows wasn't that flexible, but I'm really not up to date. Dave Gardner back there has been working with Microsoft Windows. Do you have any comments about that? Pick up. I was asked to remind everybody that when you pick it up, you hold the button and keep it held down because some of the people have been sort of being right on the edge. Okay, Dave, if you got a...
I don't believe inherently that Microsoft Windows right now, version 3, has the kind of flexibility we're talking about. Are they moving that direction? Maybe. We'll have to see. To some extent, we really haven't addressed that or worried about it too much. We're still trying to really establish, some core technology and how the platforms develop independently isn't an issue that we've addressed in depth at this point. We're just going to have to see.
Yeah, well, what I like about a lot of the questions that people ask is that really says, well, if we really had a functioning C community, that's the kind of things you need to pool your resources to find out. So Thursday, keep in mind, so Thursday when we start saying, how would you indeed design and benefit from a C community? Excuse me, go ahead.
Windows 3.1 is about to be shipped, and it struck me that without reading all of the advertising, that some of this object linking that they talk about is a step, however small, in that direction.
Yeah. Well, I really feel things have been moving because it's, if the concepts were basically right about why we wanted to get there, they'll start steering things in that way. And the real issue is, well, there'll be more things we talk about today. So let's just sort of wait till tomorrow to talk about whether we think, how much we think that the standards and the vendors need some help in evolving beyond where they are today. Okay, let's start finishing and filling out this online system picture here that's in F19. We just about got there and said that we were I was just explaining a little more of this diagram, which I apologize for dumping everybody on without some prior explaining, but if we recognize the model over here, primitive model of a human being with two aspects of the mental capabilities and perceptual and motor. So it's with the individual's motor capabilities that you actuate the different functional things that are going to fill these slots. And the group of three things right here are the three functions that operate on the computer storage and will fill out file position, view generate, etc. We'll show later. And then it's not till the display comes back that the person that finishes that loop. So anyway, this was the picture about the tool system that the individual would employ. And the concept right from the beginning was not only you're going to structure and all that, but you really want multimedia. And multimedia in the 60s was line graphics, and you watch how it's evolved more and more since then. So you can assume that that color dynamic video is technically going to be feasible to bundle up into packages you send around, and later on three-dimensional video. So there's sort of an open-end move in which all the kinds of media are going to be integrated into there. And so the way we built the actual system then to implement what we were talking about is sort of outlined in F20, and it isn't exactly what you'd say is the architectural map for how it should be done, but it's just to sort of explicate what we're talking about structure, that there was actually a set of explicit ring structure elements in a separate kind of block inside the file, and the whole file would be an envelope like that, and any of the text objects would be packaged by themselves, pointed to from all of these hierarchically organized nodes, and that these nodes could be rearranged by they would just rearrange their pointers if you said between each other if you wanted to rearrange the hierarchy. And any given time, the location in the hierarchy that you'd follow a path. You say, I'm going down to 1, going on to 2, I'm going down to 2A and then to 2B. So you just say, that's how I got to this element, and therefore that's its location identifier. It's not an intrinsic property of that element. It's just like you're the third house on the block. That just happened to be your location right now. So I just chose in the early 60s to say 1, 1A, 1B, and 1B1 rather than 1, 1.1, and 1.2.1 here. That for one of the reasons was it takes up more landscape on a display to put 1.2.1 than it does to say 1B, and we were trying to conserve it all. But you could shift modes if you wanted to and work with 1.2.1 if you wanted to. So we'll show you later how those introduced, but they're provided as a way to address things, which was really quite specific. And then there are also a substructure of these things that can represent graphics or whatever properties you want to have that lie between a given node, lie under a given node. So this is just a general gestalt to give you a feeling that it was a structured file. So we evolved to that form by 1970, which made a problem then of people sharing with us because it wasn't a linear sequential ASCII file that we're working with. But it gave us a lot more power to move. And if we move to F21 for sort of the next step, is saying, so I picked a simple hierarchical structuring, and with the assumption at that time, I think it was 1963 or 4, I chose it, and saying, well, in a couple of years as we start to learn about that, we probably will evolve to a more general structural form, some kind of, reentrant network kind of thing, and we never really got back to that. So it's still an open thing of what's sort of the best way. And on the other hand, though, we found a lot of very powerful things that evolve when the structure is an explicit hierarchy. And we'll show you that later, how that just is a very potent thing. But within any given structure you have, we just said also, look, each of those nodes in there is an explicit object. So they didn't have object technology and nomenclature at the time, but this is the way we deal with it. And an explicit node, and one of the things we can do is, besides it having a location address, is we can put a label on it, give it a name. And this emerged right out of the programming world, where you could label a statement, and that could be a computer at any place else. You could tell it to jump to that labeled place in the program. So we said, okay, we just had a convention then so that we could arbitrarily stick a name, a set of text at the front, and we made it fixed so that the computer, we could finally got it so some of the properties that are stored in each node, that are often invisible to the user in the viewing, would be a pair of characters we'd call the name delimiters. And so every time you edit a statement, the computer looks at the very first word and finds out, is it delimited by those special characters? If it is, the user meant that to be a name, and it hash codes it and sticks it in one of the cells right down there associated with it, so that you can find it much more rapidly by label, by name. So this was very valuable, giving labels. Well, then another thing is that because things would move around, and if you didn't give it a name, maybe the system ought to. So every time a node is created, it's given a unique identifier integer that goes with it all the time. We call that the statement identifier. And so you could address it by that, or by a label, or by its location. So the fact they say this isn't being done generally out there, and why not? Well, I don't know why not. It turns out to be very valuable. You'd say that sort of clutters up the user's mind, because you've got all these other things about it. You just scroll down to the paragraph you want. He says, God, well, just think, if you know it's paragraph 4b, why don't you just jump to it? Well, how will I know it? Well, suppose you were looking at it, or somebody told you about it. There are all kinds of ways you can know about it. Or if you put a label on it, you can say jump to Ajax, because that's what you're going to do, and you jump to Ajax. Or what if you want to say, I want to copy a statement from someplace else? Well, copy it to follow Ajax, so I don't even have to see it and click on it, or like that. Or I could make a copy of Ajax to put someplace else. So as you start living with those, with the fact that you think of them, they have addresses, it just starts to fit right in with your way of thinking and working. For all the world as it does geographically, if you say, I want to go over to Fred's house, I'll meet you there. Well, where does Fred live? Oh, his location is 1022 Main Street. See? Well, that just goes with his location. So he says, well, wait a minute. And he'll say, well, you know where Pete lives? Yeah, well, it's 2 doors north of Pete. Oh, well, he knew where Pete's is, so you say, oh, relative location's interesting too. So we've got nomenclature in the addressing conventions that you can say go to a given node, and then some relative addresses that you can put there. You know, S would say, oh, go to that and go to the successor. And so you get used to using that. So pretty soon as you move around in there, you find that it's extremely valuable. And it's so much, when you have to scroll and find things, again, it's just a pain in the neck by comparison when you learn to live with it. But when you're first faced with it, you say, oh, I've got to remember all those addressing things. No, you don't have to start with. But if you do start learning about them and employing them, which is no harder than learning how to find addressing around town, and it's just very powerful. And you think, paradigm-wise, when people live in little villages, they think it's silly if you go to all the formality of being able to have addresses or labels or relative things. They say, no, look, when you get a really rich landscape and you want to travel around it a lot, and you're very much more mobile than you used to be before, then it's very handy. So that's a paradigm shift. So that's one of the things people start working with Augment, they say, oh God, all these things. Other thing about it is, you find that if you're using explicit nouns to specify what kind of objects you want to deal with, again, it just offers a real flexibility. I want to move that word. You only have to click on it once. I want to move that sentence, that statement, that node. I want to move a branch, which is a given node and any substructure that goes with it. All I have to do is click on the statement that's the top of that branch, and if I said I want to move a branch, that whole thing moves. If I say a plex, that means the whole branch and all of its siblings up and down in that hierarchical level. So I can move a whole plex, or copy it just with one click by specifying the one character that specifies the class of noun I'm using. So you say, oh, then people look at it and says, you've got all these funny terms. You've got statement, plex, branch, group. And you've got funny things like transpose. What's a transpose? Well, that's a verb. Because you find out pretty soon you want to interchange things quite often. Well, you want to interchange a word or a sentence or a branch. And so it's very easy. So as you learn the verbs, you find out that a lot of them are generically applicable to many classes of nouns. So your vocabulary grows very easily this way. So anyway, all that was part of this using names and addresses for things and places, and harnessing those names and addresses for moving around. is also for manipulating elements that you don't have to see what you actually want to affect if you know its address. And you can remember them. So there are a lot of things like that. So when I start showing you around in there, things can happen, and I have to stop and explain it. But it would take a lot of days for me to show you all the ways in which a native starts employing these things. And by then you feel like it's very confusing. And you just sort of have to believe me that when you start living in that environment, and then you have to go away to something else, the only thing you can operate on is what you see and can click on. And the only thing you can do is scroll up and down, no matter what help. You really feel deprived. So anyway, so let's move on. So anyway, in F22 we highlight this thing as saying in-file addressing and links. So then you say, all right, our links, since everything has an address, very flexible, we say, well, look, if we just put a given address in a syntactically clean way of specifying it by some delimiters. We ended up using wedges, we used parentheses or anything else, but if it's syntactically recognizable by the computer and I say jump on a link and I click on this address, the computer will take me to where it's pointing. So that's our links. No mysterious hidden kind of things. They're there to look at as text. So we would think, you know, as we could increase the sophistication of our system, you'd like to have it so you could replace that link with an icon if you wanted to, like a button. But you don't have to live with this kind of world very long before you'd say, oh, but I want the option that I can say, I'd like to have that instead of a button, I'd like to show it to show me the address that it's pointing at. Because this tells you a lot about it. So the other guys, most of them, the buttons are something you can't look behind very easily. And so if they do something, they're a link that goes through in computer indexing language, not people languages, about addresses. So anyway, that just proves to be an aspect that's very valuable. So you'll see it. So in that way too, since an address, a link is a syntaxed, arranged address, it can go through email very nicely. And you can send it out through internet where it gets converted to X.400 and back into augment at the other end, and there's the link. It's still pointing to things. See? Very handy. So anyway, the in-file addresses, I've been explaining to you how all that works. And we get to sort of the stage 2 of the picture of how the Kodiak in F25, the stage 2 of what the Kodiak evolution is, says, oh, we're going to share files, but they're not going to be just simple files. We're going to start implementing files that are a better representation of what we're thinking about, so we can move around very flexibly in view. And that alone increased the power a great deal in what you can do in that shared arrangement. So we arrived at that point by 1968 when we put on the presentation that introduced this stuff to the world. And maybe tomorrow we could see that. But to make a real system out of it, it needs more things that we added. But we'll just look at saying, let's really F25 is a little bit out of position to come to think about it, because we're still trying to get in the shared file thing what you're trying to do with it. And so if we look at F26, and that file position then becomes an explicit thing. You position yourself at a node. And so it's a very specific thing, and you often get there by jumping. So we actually never really implemented scrolling. And sometimes people say, well, it'd be kind of nice just to scroll, but you jump. And you can jump by clicking on something, or just, we can show you that. So file position then is an important next step. Go ahead.
Going back to 25, I didn't understand your comment about these files. You say these aren't just regular files, but they're better representations of what you're thinking about. And maybe this is related to the question I had before, but I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, thanks for asking. No, it's the thesis we've been developing are saying if we get these structured multimedia hyperlinked kinds of files, that gives us a better chance to take what's in our head and map it out there so it can represent better what we're trying to express. And that we, furthermore, can move around and study it much more flexibly than if it doesn't have structure in these other kinds of aspects. So that's what I meant by when we started out in an early one. So we start out in F5 just saying to start out with implementing the Kodiak thing that we would just start with shared files. Oh, but let's go back and thinking about in this augmentation paradigm and such that there's the option to get away from the flat file representing a document or something in the printed document and move to something that really has got structure and relationships in there that really is a better representation for what's in our head. So that was the objective. And so the things I've outlined since then were the measures we took, which have proven very useful in that respect. And so F25 says, all right, the shared files, you're starting to get all this structure, linking, and the hypothesis that's yet to be verified in your mind of saying that gives you more powerful employment of the process of externalizing sets of symbols to represent your ideas and things that you want to communicate, externalizing them and using them to study and communicate and work with. Ted?
Is there a predefined semantics for how these links and codes are done, or is that something that evolves from the community of using them? For example, did you have an alphabet or a coding scheme for not only how you would name a document, how you would name an embedded thing within a document or an embedded concept, or is that something that you allowed the system to let the users determine for their own group?
That's a very good question. It's the user can specify his own. And so when we move over to the human side of the story, and it says, all right, what methodologies might you start employing? And within a given set of methods, what kind of conventions seem to need to follow through on how you would really do this? And those are very important things then to go pursue. So this thing has said, no, we're trying to build a generic sort of thing that you can start learning that. And we probably will have to, lots of evolution go on in the tool system to give you the freedom to learn. So the really is very valuable if you're building a management system for a complex project. So you find out, yes, there really are conventions for what you name some of your documents and files, and for naming some of the branches and certain structures in there so that everyone knows, boom, they jump to con, file so-and-so, branch stick, and what they'd find under there is the current thing you're keeping up to date for them. And
but those conventions are things that the community itself
absolutely. See, the tool system just provides the support for the evolution of the human system, and a bunch of new characteristics and capabilities in this kind of tool system. But the hypothesis is it opens up new ways of thinking and working, and that just says I open up a territory in the frontier that you've got to go explore. And what we've learned very, very thoroughly is that you can't dry lab it. That you can't sit there as a designer of this system and say, and this is the way it'll use. I got in a terrible argument with somebody in the early 60s. He said, hey, look, don't have those things be in this hierarchy like 1A and 1B and stuff. Call this one a document, and this one a chapter, and this one a section. And I said, no, you've got to keep it general. And he got so angry, he walked out of my office all red in the face. And I thought, well, no, we weren't talking very well together at that. But, all he'd have to do is go over and say, well, you're using the same exact substructure system for doing your source code in the software, and wow, the value you get out of that. And it'd be ludicrous to be trying to call it this and that. So all the way through, there's special ways to use this kind of a file structure in ways that wouldn't occur to you if you were using a conventional document file, which is what we're looking for. So anyway, in F26, the way of getting around is by jumping in. We would like to add scrolling when it makes sense, so that you think of a file position. That's sort of the way you're oriented, explicit file position. And then the next thing you're thinking of has to do with that view generator. And in F27 is a way to characterize what's that next thing we're thinking of. Remember I used the analogy, the little example the other day of if somebody asks you to think about the fuel gauge in your car, so you just right away click right on it, right? So that means you go there, and not only to an object named car or something like that, but you go to an abstraction level that's appropriate. Boom. And then you zone in on this. You don't look at the whole dash, you zoom in on this. So he said, look, one thing to tell you where to go, but there are all kinds of ways to look at that thing when you get there. And so moving very rapidly and flexibly to a given conceptual location and a level of abstraction are two things that you do all the time in your head. And this sort of thing is if people that are giving you the online computer thing say, oh, the natural thing to do is load file and scroll to your given position, that's a very unnatural thing as far as the equipment you've gotten here it ever does it. So why not open that up and give you these other options of saying, no, I can go right to the thing and look at it at whatever abstraction level that suits me. As long as the author has been doing some conventions in there that help represent how he thought the levels were, etc., mean that you can then exercise some choices about moving in there to look at it from that point of view. And simple as it sounds, and there's some terrific value that we can show examples of just everyday, very simple use. So one of the viewing options that just instantly applied was how many levels of the existing hierarchy do you want to even look at? And then, so we'd look at, say, one or two levels. Well, then sometimes it'd be very wordy. Oh, well, the next option is how many lines do you want to look at if it's a whole paragraph? So almost the standard way you dive in to look at a document, if you're not too sure about it, you look at the top level, one line each, close up the gaps, and so it's a natural table of contents. So that every time you make a jump, in any kind of jump, you have an option to alter the viewing specifications you have. So one of those specifications says, well, whatever node I'm on, I don't want to be bothered by successive nodes, just the branch underneath it. And another one says, open up one more level. So these are just two little characters. So I say, jump to that one, just branch only one level. Boom. Oh, jump to this one more level. And you just walk down a hierarchy and classification hierarchy. And it's something you just do in most of the documents you start looking at. You do that. But think about if you've gotten guidelines and handbooks and all kinds of things like that, you just start using it. And you start expecting it. It's just very powerful. So you think, well, so what's the big deal about that? Nothing, but it's just to tell you that that falls out naturally what you're doing. You didn't have to do anything special about it. So there are many places in there then if you realize that the thing that almost everything you start working with can be just embedded in one of your documents. Your source code, very good. The macros you use, the little setups and stuff used all over the place, they're not something that when you execute a certain kind of menu item, it generates for you a little special window that's the computer figures out for you how to see your file directory or something like that. No, you can just, that can be developed as you're just taking a particular view of what you know is a document. And if you have access privilege, you can stop and edit it or change it, or change that view because you know the link and stuff to generate it, stuff like that. So it's just a very different, flexible, general environment that works. And we'll kind of show you. So F29 kind of gets up to the kind of whole way. So that's that's how you can move around inside of the file structure and working with it. And these pictures in F30, 31, and 32 are just showing you some examples, common examples of the simplest kind of view configurations, and they're taken from a document that you actually have in the back of the binder. But you actually have in the back of the binder, she says, trying to find it. Yeah, it's that under section R. So let's just take a look at R and look at the funny way the format is with these out on the right margin. And he says, you know, we've been printing our things like that for a long time. And we get a lot of flack from people who says, it doesn't look good. We spend centuries developing typography of what looks good, and you come along and cruddy it up with this, see? And we say, well, I'm sorry, it adds a lot of utility. Well, forget it. I'm not going to publish anything like that. So anyway, we just steadfastly go ahead, and where we have the option of control, that's the way we print it out. And you say, well, why? I mean, well, if I'm reading it and I want to tell somebody else about it, all I have to do is say, oh, it's in 4B2. Well, if that guy happens to be online, he can go right to it. Or I can send an email to the guy when all I have is a little terminal attached to somebody in the internet and email, and I can say I've been reading it. Go to OAD, 2250, 4B2, and that will find that passage any place in the augment environment, which you know it can. So anyway, so in this thing section, the whole branch on 6 talks about the addressability. And so it goes on for quite a few pages, different options. Branch 7 talks about controlling the views. So I tell you what, when we get online, we'll go look at that and sort of see what it looks like, just as an example. So with these same views, like in F30, it's looking at branch 7 with one particular view, but looking at it in a window that looks like it's about 30 characters, 40 characters wide, I don't know, you count them. That's exactly what you'd see with one view that said, I want to see everything wide open with blank lines between the nodes and show me the location number in the front of the node. And then if I says, oh, just show me the first line, but this in one more level, I would see what's in F31. If I said, well, I'm not sure, but what there might be something beyond 7D under there in F31, change the view to not include a blank line between the nodes, and I would see F32 to see, ah, yes, I only have A, B, C, and D. So that's just an everyday operation that people do. And in F33, it says, well, I've got A, B, C, and D. I've got the view spec on that says only show me what's under branch 7. Show me anything that's in the ensuing plex. Bingo, then it adds 8 and 9. And I say, well, that gives me an idea of the context I am. Switch back to one branch and show me another level. And that gives you F34. And then you says, well, look, by now I kind of know where I am, and those location numbers in front clutter up my view. Turn them off. That's another view spec, and you get F35. So those are just everyday things. So you said, well, what do I want to have that tells the computer how to set up the view? Because I have more and more options I find are valuable for viewing. Do I have a dialog box that I got to go click on things? Well, it turns out that that's pretty clever. Do I have a command that I actually execute a command for each one? Well, we provide that, but you find out that you really want it much quicker than that. And so we get a very cryptic kind of alphabetic coding system that specifies what your viewing options, viewing alternative want to be. And it's got a very rational design behind it, but you have to memorize it. So that's pretty soon what says, oh, geez, that's too hard. But you use it. You use it. every time you move. And it's sort of like you said, well, let's see. If I'm skiing, I'm going down a hill and I come over a hummock, and when I get down, I want to shift and go off to my left obliquely. Do I have to stop, execute turn, and then start again? No. In the midair, I come down, shift and come down the way I want to go. See, it's that sort of thing. It says, it's worth learning how to do that. So he says, all right. So a couple of years ago, there was some people at Apple that got very interested in what we were doing, and we built a version of OggTerm running in C that would work on a Macintosh, and it never got really completed. But he was experimenting with Macintosh-like interfaces. So in this jump, you do a jump, and then there'd be a dialog box, and you could click on different places that gave you the choices of how you'd like to re-establish the view. And there were enough options, the dialog box filled the whole screen, and you go click, 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 boom. And you know where we're going, boom, you're done, see? So they said, well, we'll put the letters by there that you could hit on the, if you're moving, and then you could choose later you learn the letters to specify it, and you can do that. But then you still have to look down and hit the letters with two hands, so compare the key set. So you really realize that this is the paradigm thing of the very nice things that dialog boxes provide for you. If your vocabulary grows to a certain point and the fluency with which you want to work gets past a given point, then you need to be able to set that aside and go in a faster direction. So anyway, we get back to we sort of essentially filled in F39 the image of the system we wanted to build. And with the advent also of saying we would like to have other screens share it and other files sharing in that, and you have at this point what we built in the had running by the late 60s, Evolve. And so then we've added a lot more to that through the years that we'll look at a little bit below. So one of them is the shared screen, which we've already talked about. In F40, it sort of outlines the kinds of, some of the prominent kinds of ways you'd use the shared screen facility. And I'll just pass that up right now. We've already talked about it basically. And then F41 just sort of shows you, oh, you know, if you're moving around through these files, Z can take X and Y with her as she's moving. A very flexible way in looking. They can share things. That's sort of just a way to representing how that shared screen can work on your files. But incidentally, the shared screen thing, all it is that the showing person only needs access to the files the way it's figured in ours, and the viewers don't have to have access. They can just be taken along for the ride in the view, and they don't even have to know how to operate or have access to the application that's being shown either. They can still be taken along for the view. So the next step past F41 was a pretty big system step, and it's to say add the capability to email any portion of your hyperdocument. So we had that working by 1970, and though it came along with the realization, I'd also designed something that we ended up calling the journal. And so it turns out that we brought them both up at the same time, and I turned off the email, the throwaway mail, and they could only use the journal for communicating, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. But if those people that are only provided with the email, and even if it's integrated into your hyperdocument system, there's still the problem of the accumulation of a lot of email interchange, and what do you do with it? How do you find it? And how do I know if 2 weeks after I saw one of your email items, I send you a mail to say, hey, you know, I've been thinking, the wording you used in the third paragraph, and that's enough context, because when you send it to him, you're not sure he's going to be able to find what he sent to you. You've got this doubt. And so you have to take provisional steps anyway. And some of the systems I keep getting is people just copy whole paragraphs and retransmit it back with a comment on it like that. So I say, well, am I supposed to copy that copy and send that back, and the thing snowballs? So these kind of expected problems that arise, and as well as the thing that, for me in the later 60s, the image about what you're going to need to do is keep a record of the dialogue that goes on, so that it's an important trail for several things. It kind of shows why designs and decisions were made, or why mistakes were made in design decisions that you want to go back to and look at. And he says, well, that in the dialogue, every kind of entry, like an email, something, is like in the transaction world, it's an accounting transaction. So let's build something like the journal, so that transaction event gets put in the journal, and later it can be posted and done with as you want to, but you really have that act recorded that you can go back to. So we've designed something that we call the journal system. And so the option would be then, if you're going to send something via email, you can specify that it's to be journaled. And so let's just talk about that. This paradigm shift about email. We look at F45 and say, we add another horizontal domain there that we call the journal. And that's full of documents that are permanently stored and unchangeable. And people says, well, you mean permanent? I says, practically permanent. When you say practically, well, if it gets lost or something, that's your problem. But the value of it comes if the administrative and system setup associated with a journal tries to guarantee that any time you ask for it by its identifier, what you're going to get is exactly what the author put in there. No changes. And so that's what we built. So as I contemplated then people using that, I just could picture they're saying, let's see, I don't think this is very permanent. I'll just send it email instead of journal. So because I didn't know what policy to set of when to journal and when not to journal, what I decided is I'd strap shut so you could, the only way you could communicate via electronic interchange like email was through these permanently stored records in the journal. Well, this made a fair amount of impedance about getting people to use it, but I don't know what else we could have done. And that way we really learned how valuable it was, and by several years later, talking about time constants, it took several years before the flow of that began natural. And people have a design meeting, and it just matter of course, even among software guys, that, okay, we're all done now, we've agreed on it, who's going to write it up and put it in the journal? Okay, I'll do it this time. It was just a matter of course. So into the journal went the record of what they decided in that meeting and anything else that seemed relevant. So that started in 1970, and later we got other journals that you could add. Administratively, you could run as many as you want, so any given customer could have one or more depending on what domain of activity they had. But we kept that original one running for all of the interchanges that were common across all the users, including a lot of our design stuff goes. And currently that's up to 132,000 items in there like that. So, yeah, Mark?
Doug, doesn't that really start to geometrically explode the amount of system resources you need to store that kind of stuff?
Mm-hmm.
I know in Cummins we implemented sort of an office system in the early 80s, and within a year it used up half of the disk space of the entire corporation.
Yeah. So we built the system such that it kept track of when each of these things was last accessed, and anytime the allocated space in the disk started to get crowded, we put onto tape those that were the longest since accessed. So when you jump to one, if it isn't online, you get the message up in your system line. It says it's not online, do you want it? All you have to do is click yes. An automatic message goes to operators, and when they finally get it loaded, an automatic email comes to you with a link to it saying it's here. And so I mentioned to you once before that the biggest customer we ever had operating on this that was best organized through about from 82 to 87 or something like that. Really had a lot of really effective administrative operations and methods going on this. And one of them was when they submitted something like this, they decided they didn't want to keep them for a long time, so they put the dispensation code. There was put a new field entry in that, so it said when this could reasonably be thrown away. And so that cleared the air for those guys. And but you'll notice over here is a catalog that when something goes in the system and gets cataloged. So we got to thinking, how are we going to go back to all those tapes and remove those files? And what we figured out was much cheaper just to remove the item from the catalog and not tell the user that they were still not there on the files, because it was cost more to go and get them out of the archive tapes than it did to carry them. So anyway, the way the journal works is kind of shown in F46. That usually you can whip something together that's only a one-liner as you'd be constructing an email you're going to send, and launch it to the journal so it's on record very quickly. But most of the more substantial things you prepare as a whole file that's going to go in. And so that sitting there is the document D, and you make a submittal form that's exactly like an email thing you're going to send, except it has a field in it that said what journal to put it in. And if you've had a pre-assigned number, identifier number, you can stick that in there to say give it that number. And there are many other fields that are only relevant for something going in a journal system. Keywords, or this item supersedes item number so-and-so. This is part of a document set that's structured and identified in document so-and-so and things like that. So those fields grew. So when that's all ready, you go through the submittal. It's just exactly like sending it an email. And these three things happen. So the journal catalog gets updated, a copy of the file gets moved into the archive, and henceforth protected mightily from any kind of change, and a little announcement, citation comes out, email gets distributed to everybody that was on the 2 and the CC list, etc. Gets a little email thing that says, this new journal item, here's the subject, here's the author, here are the keywords, da-da-da, and here's a link pointing to it, and that's your announcement that there's been one put out there. So that's all you have to carry care of, that tidy little announcement. And if you want to see it, you just jump on the link to it. So that's the journal system. So what value is it? Well, every element in every one of those journalized documents is a stationary target that you can comment on safely from any time hereafter, and you know that when someone reads your comment, they can follow the link to what you're commenting about and study its context to understand what you're talking about. So it just made a big jump in the kind of ways in which the dialogue started being relevant and the record of it. So it's extremely valuable, and it's essentially the hypertext publishing that people have been talking about, except when it's, I mean, it is, and it's just extremely valuable. And again, you have to live with it a while before you start getting the value of it. But if you remember this document that we looked at in under section R, it went into the OAD journal and was given its identifier number 2250, and it was published on 9 December 83 at exactly 1743. So you say, when you've got a system like this, it's not just what year it was published or what month, it's down to what minute, because 10 minutes later something in the journal could appear as somebody commenting on already. So the cycle time of that, the cycle time and the specificity with which you can cite something, and the fact that you don't have to provide any context at all in your citation because you can guarantee that the reader can go look at it, just means that the whole dialogue process gets accelerated.
Doug, can we do
Ted?
that example for a second? In the back of that, you've got codes for the references section, and some are embedded in the text when you're actually referring to citations. In the references, they're bracketed as ref 1, ref 2, and then they also, along the right-hand edge, have these other codes in there.
Right.
Which is I just need an explanation of how that convention was worked out.
Okay, that when we cited that in the text, and if we just use a location number, it wouldn't mean much to somebody. But if you give it a label, ref1 and f2 of those are actual labels of those things, so they're valid addresses. So when you're reading that online, you see ref1, you say jump name, boom, you're off looking at this citation of ref1.
Did you use that same thing for something other than references? If you wanted to see just graphics or pieces of media that were embedded in the document, you would name them that way as well?
Yeah, absolutely. That's part of the value that you can start utilizing. And what's more, I can show you a convention that this kind of reference thing was there enough. So you could say, well, I can make a link where I could say ref1 and @ 4b. And if you jumped on a link on that, the convention for how the computer would interpret that is just looks at that syntax as, aha. It would come down here and find ref1. It would go to the tail and see the journal item. It would go to that journal item, and it would go to 4b in that. So it's a very nice, compact way to cite a given passage in a document in a way that sort of fits so near it. So those are the kind of conventions and methodologies that are just there to explore. Very, very flexible. So anyway, then just to accelerate a little bit, in F49 there's another system edition that we had. We were working on that from the very first in the 60s. That was said, hey, well, you've got catalogs and all this mobility in there. Are you going to forget the fact that you deal with external documents? You know? So you said, no. You know, I'm using them still. Well, as long as you're still using them, how about having a way to control them in here? See, well, great. This has got a xdoc number 834. See? So you set up essentially what's a different kind of journal that you put in a catalog, and you give them identifiers, and you can put control information on there, where to find them, etc. But since it's in the catalog, and you start to evolve the system so you get some backlinkage capability, so in the journal item you can ask the catalog, has anybody else coming along lately and been pointing to me in the journal? That's very valuable. It says, well, you can look in the catalog of an xdoc item and say, is there something in the journal now? What are the journal entries that are citing me? And which starts to bring the externalized kinds of material into the dialogue more effectively and controlling them to boot. So he says, oh, why not just a generalized starting to do records management of all kinds in this same environment, and those records that have this hyperdocument sort of form are much richer to work with, etc. So we built that, and when we started the Network Information Center, we became a library like that, and there were some thousands, 3,000 or 4,000 items in that library. And it turned out that none of the people that we were servicing was at all oriented about such irrelevant things as records management. So we couldn't sustain the support that needed. So that died out about 1973 or 4 with thousands of items, catalog, etc. And so the history of paradigm shifts. So what I'd like to do is, at this point, just shift, and let's go online and answer a question first.
Yeah, Doug, you're saying these external documents, you didn't have any support to maintain the system. Were these originally supplied by, say, the journal entry people? People who make a journal entry and they say, I have this external document they refer to, and this is the name of it?
Oh, they'd come in various ways. Somebody had sent an email or sent a document to ask the clerks to enter it in there. So this was, that we finally said for that xdoc, we had some clerk support that did the entry. And you'd either say, here's a photocopy of the title page, I'd like that entered, can you give me a number for it now so I can talk about it, but it'll get logged in. So that's how it usually handled. And incidentally, it was very, very useful for external correspondence, because I didn't have to figure out any kind of fancy filing system. They just got plugged in by the XDoc number they were assigned, and in the catalog I could scan by things and find out, oh, that's number so-and-so. Very useful. But I should worry about answering your question before I tell these other stories. Did I? Yes.
I think I just need a little clarification.
Can you be sure that this gets...
Do you hear that? Is this system only for final form documents, or is there document creation here? Are you handling versioning in this system?
Oh, yes. It's
Can you explain that a little bit to me?
The whole environment. I mean, the whole business of creating and structuring and organizing your document, as well as collaborating about it, as well as then sticking them in the journal. And versioning is very handy to use in there, because it goes in the journal and, boy, that's the new version, and it's got a entry in it that says it supersedes so-and-so. So it's a beautiful way to control that. And you can go back and look at the prior item and who's been talking about it to see the evolutionary reasoning that went before it.
And were you requiring of your users file name conventions before they could work within the system?
No. Well, just like in any other system, I know a user in his own work can start making whatever file name conventions they want. If the group starts saying, hey, some of your files we'd like the rest of us to know how to access, things like that, so let's follow some conventions maybe, or just tell us, post the names. And then in some of the more formal methodologies, actually they would start getting sort of here are the standards for the way to do the files, to name them so that they're locatable. And one of the interesting things about our linkage capability is in an address you can point to a location, a node in a document file. And that can get there by exact address plus relatives, and plus even when you get to this point, find the next node that's got this content in it, even that flexible. And at any point along that relative one, you could say, oh, and take the link you find there and off to some other place, and you could keep on repeating it. So that indirect linkage is an extremely powerful thing then of in management and planning and coordinating activities, that you as a manager might say, I'm keeping a file of a given name, and there's a branch in there with a given name, so you know anytime you can find that. And underneath that I have nodes that I'll make a consistent identifier of labels or something. And in these nodes I'll keep links of a specified direction. I'll maintain these links, so the first one will always point to project X current status. And so you can